There's something amiss with Meghan's show, specifically with her guests. As I've been slowly working my way through this thing, it's been rough, it's been drab. But there's something that's just really been standing out and nagging me sort of when I watch this that's quite bothersome and distracting about this show. And it's not fully about Meghan, actually. What's been catching my eye is the way the guests appear to be completely lost and clueless throughout the episodes. It's as if they are completely bewildered by the thing. They have no idea what's happening or where they're going or what's going to happen next. They look almost like they're on eggshells, and a lot of you guys who did take a chance and try to watch the show have said that, or even if you've just seen clips, you've left comments and feedback saying that it looks almost like the guests are afraid to speak or unsure of what to say or do, like they're a little nervous perhaps. And so I think it stands out a lot when they're going from place to place. They do some of the show in what looks like maybe a little mudroom sort of a thing that looks detached, or perhaps a different part of the house. And then the rest of it they do in this like guest house, guest kitchen. So when Meg just sort of abruptly is like, okay, and we're going to go this way and do this now, or okay, we're moving on to the next thing, the guests just sort of toddle along with a rather clueless look on their faces. They look very unsure, they look uncertain, except for maybe the chefs. Roy Choi, for example, or Alice Waters, for example, they seemed a little bit more comfortable. They're more used to the format, and they were taking on real tasks that they felt confident in and familiar with. So this phenomenon was definitely less prominent in those episodes, but it's definitely there for the friends that she has included. It was very prominent with Daniel, Mindy as well. And it was just very distracting because they do look a little bit uncomfortable. They do look like they're sort of on eggshells, very much uncomfy, which is, of course, the opposite of what Meghan says this show is all about. It's all about being a great hostess and hospitality and making sure your guests always feel fully comfortable. So why would they show clips and leave it there like that and not reshoot if the guests are looking this uncomfortable and it's this obvious? But naturally, this will lead you to wonder, what could the possible reason for this be? Why do they look uncomfortable? Why are they acting this way, like they're so clueless and sort of unsure? If we rule out the Meg copping a tude with any of them, which we know that happens. We saw her snapping at Mindy Kaling multiple times. We've seen her, correcting people and sort of having a little bit of a weird attitude that you normally wouldn't do with guests at your house or just in general in friendships. A sort of a strange dynamic. So we know that happens. But if we set that aside for the time being and try to think of some other possible reason or excuse for the guests to be acting this way, then it could be reasonably that they are not necessarily used to all the camera and crew, and that's a little bit overwhelming. The setting isn't comfortable for everybody, especially if you're not used to being around a lot of TV cameras and film crew and stuff. These are strangers who don't talk because they're focused on getting the shot, and they know if they make noise, they ruin the shot. So everybody's very, very quiet who's in the production side of things, typically. And so that can be kind of uncomfortable or even maybe a little unsettling for people who aren't used to it. It can feel a little intimidating. But at the same time, all of these guests agreed to this and knew that they were going to be around a bunch of film crew and knew that this was going to be filmed for the show, obviously. So they did agree to it ahead of time. So I'm not sure that would fully explain the situation. It could also be, though, that they weren't fully briefed on what the procedure would be or how the day would really go. And Meg alluded to this a few times throughout the series, like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do, or I have nothing to feed so-and-so. Sort of this lack of preparation she even admits to at times. And when she tells the guests what they're going to do, it often does feel a little bit on the fly and less prepped and organized to some extent. So we get the vibe that Meghan thought she could just wing a lot of this, and perhaps the guests also we're roped into that in her mind, that because she does treat her guests like props, she maybe never even thought to brief them on what to expect for the day. Even something as simple as, we're going to shoot for a couple hours doing candles, and then we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to shoot for a couple hours doing cake, and then we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to shoot for a couple hours where we're going to make tea and go eat the cake. Whatever. Even something as simple as that helps the guest know what to expect and when they may be able to, take a break or ask other questions or anything that they might need. And it feels like there's a strong chance that Meghan did not provide this information to the guests. It could also be Meg's lack of communication in the moment, that she sort of abruptly changes gears. There's not really any smooth transition between each scene or each part of the show. It typically has some sort of a nonsensical tutorial that's so common sense, it's frivolous and ridiculous. We don't need a tutorial on it, but she gives a sort of tutorial on something. She does a little cooking. She does a little bit more of a tutorial or a different tutorial, and then more cooking. And then at the end, they, taste the food or eat or kind of have some sort of conclusion where they sit down and chat a little bit. Really barely at all. Meg kind of repeats what they did or how they did it, even though we just saw how they did it and it was only a 30-minute episode, that sort of a thing. But between each of those moments, those maybe 5 parts to the show, she doesn't transition smoothly into them. She just is sort of like, okay, now let's go do this. And she just kind of tells it to the guest that abruptly. And it feels a little out of nowhere. It doesn't have a good flow. And so the guest may also feel like, whoa, oh my gosh, we're changing gears now. And that might explain this sort of uncomfortable bewilderment that we see on their faces. It could also be just the dynamic that they know she's a little bit prickly and very, very particular, and that's not always a bad thing. We all have people in our lives who are very particular, very picky. You do have to kind of cater to them a little bit more than some of the more laid-back people in your life. Of course, naturally. But it could be that the people who are a little bit more familiar with the Meg have experienced unpleasant interactions, or things got really awkward, or maybe Meg just kind of abandons the situation. Like, if it's not going to go this way, or you're not going to do things how I want, then I'm just going to go and this isn't going to be happening here. She could be that extreme with it to where it's socially unacceptable. And these people are watching out for that. Maybe that's a reason. Unfortunately, we don't know. But what I can say is that we have seen a pattern with Meghan of lack of preparation previously, and it's pretty well documented. So I think it's safe to assume that this does stem from a lack of preparation and a lack of extending some degree of prep to these guests. Because even the way they introduce them on the show and have them walk in past production, they all look really sheepish, almost like they've been scolded by someone before they get onto set. It's so bizarre the way they introduce them and show them coming in. I think they thought that including this sort of an approach would feel more authentic in a way, but it doesn't, because it reminds the viewer that, oh, this is being filmed, there's tons of production people around, and the way the guests enter, the first time we lay eyes on the guest, they're always like hunched over, stepping into the room with all these production people around, and they look like shrunken. It's so strange. I've never seen anything like that on a show like this that greets guests. I know the comparisons are not really fair because Ina is so great, but Ina Garten, compared to Meg, is like miles and miles away from each other. It's like black and white. It's just not, you can't really compare them. But Ina Garten's very skilled, very talented, set the bar really high, and she did do a show series, it might still be going, where she would have a guest come, and it wasn't always somebody she knew. Sometimes it was somebody she knew, but when they met, it wasn't all these production people around, and it wasn't like they were coming in all sheepishly. They just walk on into her house, and it's very normal feeling, and it gives you the sense that you're just there joining in and It's very comfortable feeling. Very good example of the contrast between how Meghan introduced her guests and how they enter the show versus what you might expect, and for good reason. But Meghan Markle's history of being ill-prepared kind of touches on almost everything she's done and almost everything we've seen her in. And it's part of why she says stupid things or looks super awkward or resorts to seal claps and hugging or touching everyone in sight. Because when you're not prepared, you're less confident. You just are. Your anxiety tends to be worse when you're less prepared. And in this case, when you have other people who are kind of depending on you to prep them as much as possible, and you neglect to do that, then that becomes all the more prominent. The lack of prep and the sort of awkward anxiousness of it all. And when you are more anxious, then you do sometimes start moving too quickly or talking too quickly or just rambling and filling in the space, because that's a normal response to feeling a little bit anxious. And so it catches up to the Meg when she's not prepared, and that's what we get. We get chaos and nonsense. In this context, for something like a show, it's not only a bad idea for the show itself and the content itself, but it's also really inconsiderate to the guests to not prepare properly. And being ill-prepared and disorganized does come through on screen. It really, really does come across negatively on screen. And it looks like things are half-assed. And of course, you can't help but think, if you are doing a show, a real live show with a big budget probably, and you can't even be prepared for that, you can't even be bothered to be organized and prepared for that, then you're not really trying, are you? And for the guests, it results in these sorts of looks of puzzlement and cluelessness and confusion, which again doesn't come across well on screen. And it makes them look uncomfortable, which again is opposite of the premise of the show and what Meghan keeps saying, that she keeps hyping herself up as this great hostess who always makes her guests feel so comfortable, which also a lot of people have picked up on. Maybe the show premise itself is a bit of a clap back to the royal family. I know people have mentioned the specific things of like tea making and cakes and all these different things and jams and honey being very much lifted from the royals as things that could be clapbacks themselves, little individual ones. Yes. But also just in general, Meghan has claimed that she wasn't made to feel comfortable with the royal family. And so now she has a show all about how great she is as a hostess, making everyone feel so comfortable. And it's just hard to believe when your guests look like this. So this lack of preparation and these sorts of looks on the guests is undermining the vibe of the show, which is further accentuated by the way the guests don't have any sort of natural or engaging conversation. And they do a lot of just out of place or strained or what feels almost scripted complimenting of the Meg. Rumor has it that Meghan did provide her guests some talking points with suggestions of things to say or things to ask, which did include things like potential responses about how nice things look or how delicious things are or how amazing something is, being sure to mention the jam or preserves all of the time. And tasting it out of the jar. That's another thing that was allegedly included in these sort of talking points and briefs. But what was left out of it was the format and actual prep for the guests. The rumor is that they were just given papers with specific things to ask or say. Don't forget to taste the jam and tell adjectives that were supposed to be used, but no actual real expectation of what to expect. So of course they would be nervous because they're sitting there trying to figure out how and when they can throw in these specific sorts of compliments that they were requested to provide Meghan. So if that's true, it's not only incredibly bizarre, but it tells us that she failed to tell the guests what they would actually be doing and how the day would go, but also that she basically told them to praise things, which is very strange and not normal for these types of shows, by the way. Other arenas where we have seen her lack of preparation come through and show up in bad ways, sort of self-sabotaging ways, very common with narcissists, include her last podcast, Archetypes, where she obviously didn't invest enough time familiarizing herself with the guests or prepping questions to be able to make it a good and interesting listen. Heck, she didn't even interview half the guests herself. She just plugged in voiceovers after the fact. So the lack of preparation definitely had a negative impact on that. And we'll likely see the same thing with her next podcast, really boring, drab, surface level nonsense with a clear lack of preparation. And a big part of why this is extra bad for the Meg is because she has claimed so often that she is so detail oriented, that she pays attention to things, little things like photoshopping mistakes would never happen for the Meg because she has a freakish eye for detail, she said about herself. She claims to be so meticulous in everything and so good at everything she does and so capable and detail oriented specifically. But then what she produces and brings forth to the world is anything but that. So the incongruency between what she says she is and what she actually delivers is massive and only being highlighted in situations like these. We also saw her lack preparation or unwilling to commit to preparing when she was with the royal family. Many sources came out and said that Meghan refuses to read up on the events, organizations, or people that she was going to visit. She refused to read the briefs ahead of time. She would glance through it that morning or in the car on the way there, but she never would actually read it, study it, and digest it in a way that she could actually deliver any sort of value. And this ties right back into why she never had anything good to say. When she gets a chance to speak on a microphone, it's just nonsense. When she is speaking with people or doing interviews even, it's just nonsense. When she's doing this show or podcasting, she's never having stimulating and interesting conversations because she doesn't have anything good to say. When you prep properly, you have more brain space to dedicate to paying attention to the moment and the social cues, the conversation, and the actual body language and whatnot with your guest and connecting with your guest. Same goes for other formats, but in this specific format, she's having to put a lot of her focus and concentration on just keeping things running and keeping it together enough to get through the tasks. And she's unable to focus on the guests in a way that's meaningful and would lead to interesting conversations because she's so ill prepared that she's having to dedicate all her brain power to just sorting out what's right in front of her. The same thing goes in other settings, like when she would do a visit with the royal family. Instead of being able to actually talk to people and connect with people and focus on the moment at hand, she was either worried about how it was going to look and trying to find the camera and pose, which was ridiculous and see-through, or she was just trying to remember what was happening around her and get through the event. It always felt like she was just trying to get through the event. And part of that was because she was so ill-prepared that it all felt rushed and that vibe carried through. But I guess at the end of the day, if you only think about yourself, you'll really only be able to talk about yourself. And a lack of preparation has these sorts of consequences. Everything just comes off as a bad, rough draft. Thank you for joining me for today's video. I hope you have a happy day ahead, and I will see you next time. Bye.